Welcome to LSE for today's event. This is the LSE's 8th edition of the festival, and this year's theme is Visions for the Future. We are hosting a week of events from the 16th of June to the 21st of June, during which we explore the threats and opportunities of the near and distant future and what a better world could look like. My name is Seeta Peña Gangadharan. I am Associate Professor and Deputy Head of Department in Media and Communications here at LSE. I am delighted to welcome Professor Ruha Benjamin to both our online audience and our in-person audience here in the Great Hall. What a great way to celebrate Juneteenth.
Yes.
Ruha is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, and award-winning author of Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, published in 2019, Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want, published in 2022, and Imagination, a Manifesto, published last year. Ruha is the recipient of many awards and countless fellowships, including the American Council of Learned Societies, National Science Foundation, Margaret Casey Foundation Freedom Scholar Award, President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton, and most recently, the MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. Technologies have the potential to deepen discrimination while appearing neutral and even benevolent when compared to harmful practices of a previous era. In today's talk, Ruha will take us into the world of biased tools, altruistic algorithms, and their many entanglements, and will provide conceptual tools to decode tech predictions with historical and sociological insight. For those in the audience who are social media users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Festival. I would ask you to please put your phones on silent so as to not disrupt the event. I'm required to direct your attention to the fire exits, which you can see by that little green sign with a person and a white arrow. There are 3 there, there, and there. And I also need to remind you that we abide by the LSE Code of Speech. Now, as to the format of the event, Ruha will speak for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and then, as usual, we will have time for question and answer. For our online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature, and please, please, please do include your name and affiliation. And for those of you here in the Great Hall, I'll let you know when we will open the floor for questions. And I ask that you please raise your hand and wait for the stewards with the roving microphone to get to you. And also, please let us know your name and affiliation. I'll try to ensure that there is a range of questions from both our online and in-person audiences. And now, without further ado, Professor Ruha Benjamin.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm so thankful that you guys came out of this gorgeous weather and day. You are officially peak nerd status, because I don't know if I'd be here if I wasn't speaking. So thank you so much to the festival team for gathering us, for inviting me, and of course to my wonderful colleague Seeta, whose own work has been really a beacon for me over many years. So if we finally get to be in conversation, it's a thrill. So as Seeta mentioned, today is Juneteenth in the US, also referred to as Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, as it commemorates the emancipation of enslaved people in the US, or more precisely, the delayed emancipation of Black Americans in Texas, because they received news almost 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. What's often not appreciated about Juneteenth is that even this belated news of Black emancipation was met with violent backlash by a fearful and vengeful white population. This was a backlash against the very idea of Black citizenship and Black dignity, the persistence of which continue today. But this is not the only legacy. There has always been a parallel history, not of one-time proclamations, but of ongoing social struggle focused on genuine freedom, not only legal emancipation. This is an ongoing legacy of freedom fighting we see on the streets of my hometown of Los Angeles and across the US, everyday people who've taken to the streets to resist the terror unleashed on immigrant and racialized communities. We see it internationally in the bravery aboard those aboard the Madeleine Freedom Flotilla and those traveling across North Africa to break the siege of Gaza. And we see it in the Netherlands, where I was last week. Tens of thousands of Red Line protesters gathered in The Hague to call for an end to the Palestinian genocide. Across this warming planet, more and more people are demonstrating courage and conviction, love and solidarity in the face of growing authoritarianism and oppression. In the process, technologies of war, technologies of empire, technologies of surveillance are not only being questioned and critiqued, but actively resisted and reimagined, even as the powers that be are working overtime to convince us that democracy is an outmoded software. If I had to boil down the stakes of our conversation this evening, I'd say it's this question: who owns the future? Or more precisely, what values, what knowledges, aspirations, desires, and worldviews are guiding or colonizing our shared future? And for the Trekkies in the room, you'll recognize who this is, hopefully. I think it should give us pause that the same people hyping AI as a solution to all of our problems are often the ones causing those problems to begin with. Take, for example, J.D. Vance, who at the Paris AI Summit a few months ago stated that, quote, "Our schools will teach students how to manage, how to supervise, and how to interact with AI-enabled tools as they become more and more a part of our lives," who also gave a speech in 2021 titled, "The Universities Are the Enemy." In his words, if any of us want to do the things we want to do for our country and for the people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country, he said. More recently, anti-DEI crusader Chris Rufo, in describing his self-proclaimed counter-revolution blueprint, said that in attacking the US Department of Education, the Trump administration must go after the ideological programs, the grants for critical race theory, gender ideology, liberatory pedagogy, whatever you may have, all of that just needs to be burned to the ground. I mean, really, truly, it needs to be gutted and dismantled. Likewise, the founder of the anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic philosophical movement known as the Dark Enlightenment, a character named Curtis Yarvin, who has the ear of many Silicon Valley elites. Yarvin argues that, quote, "The most powerful people in the world today, measured strictly by their ability to influence the real world, are journalists and professors." Now, the professors in the room, I know you don't feel that powerful, but apparently they think we are. Finally, in describing students, who we can see as putting that liberatory pedagogy into practice, Palantir CEO Alex Karp said, "We kind of think those things that are happening on college campuses are a sideshow." No, they are the show. Because if we lose the intellectual debate, You will not be able to deploy an army in the West ever. My point is that we should think carefully about the fact that so-called guardians of the galaxy are the ones causing many of the problems against which we must guard. And two, if those attacking higher education understand the dangers of liberatory pedagogy and learning, then we sure as hell need to embrace its power for social transformation. So while we continue to be sold a never-ending barrage of fantasies and fears about artificial intelligence, fantasies and fears, two sides of the same Bitcoin, I want to draw our attention to another kind of AI, ancestral intelligence. That is the knowledge and know-how born under the rubble of progress, the kind of intelligence lacking in those Dr. King referred to when speaking to an audience of students at Stanford University over 60 years ago. He said, "We have guided missiles and misguided men." Ancestral intelligence, in my view, goes hand in hand with yet another kind of AI. You have some people at the door. If someone could open it up, I think it's okay. Thank you. It goes hand in hand with abundant imagination. So while ancestral intelligence is about what we inherit, abundant imagination is about what we pass down to future generations, a point to which I'll return. But first, I thought I'd share with you how I came to think seriously about the vital role of imagination in our lives. About 15 years ago, I was starting my first job as a professor, trying to learn everything that I could about teaching because somehow they skipped that part in grad school. I came across this famous study conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. The researchers were interested, so they can't come in? The people can't come in? Oh, I see. I don't think they seem stuck over there, so I don't know if they know exactly where to go. So these researchers were interested in measuring the capacity for what they call divergent thinking. That is, the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of thinking through a problem. So what they did was they followed a cohort of 1,600 children over many years, and every year gave them a creativity test that was originally designed for NASA recruits. And the results for them were shocking in that nearly 100% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius category for divergent thinking. More shocking still was that every year that number dropped until only 12% of 15-year-olds, 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, this inherent genius that we all possess is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imaginations is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized, not inevitably, but predictably. And it's not just the individual students who suffer, it's society as a whole when we don't heed Toni Morrison's words, that as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. So what if we took imagination seriously, not as flights of fancy or something reserved only for self-proclaimed artists, but imagination as a resource, a capacity, a muscle? How might the powers of our collective imagination begin to transform the world around us? So to explore these questions, we're going to try a little exercise. We're going to split the room in half, and for those of you in this fuzzy middle part, you just get to decide which side you want to be on, okay? Everyone on this side, your catchphrase is, "Be bold." And when I point to you, you need to shout it in unison like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket in the sky. You ready? Be bold. Oh, okay. I'm going to chalk that up to heat stroke, okay? Y'all are warm. Let's try it again. Ready? Be bold. Hold that thought. This side, your catchphrase is, "Get real." And I want you to say it like the boredest teenager ever, okay? Are you ready? Get real. Space travel. Be bold. Free public transportation. Get real. Colonize Mars. Be bold. Decolonize Earth. Get real. AI superintelligence. Be bold. Cancel student debt. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Build affordable housing for all. Spend billions on weapons and war. Invest in peace and well-being for all. You get the picture. Boldness is rationed, while realism is mass-produced. We are in many ways trapped inside the lopsided imagination of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Now, these futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our digital and physical realities, but their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone has the chance to live a good and meaningful life. So how can we be bold when it comes to our social vision? I think for starters, heeding the insight of Tony Cade Bambara, not all speed is movement. Slowing down, because as we race to create bigger, faster, shinier systems, there are so many questions we don't ask, so many communities we don't consult. So here you see two images, one from a prior era of racial domination in the US, and the image on your right is from the first few weeks of the pandemic here in the UK, where the government decided to use an algorithm to predict students' A-level grades, you will remember. And you see the students had a lot of poetic things to say about those algorithms. One sign in particular is very instructive. Here, they're making a connection between grades and postal codes, saying our grades shouldn't equal our postal codes. This is an important reminder that the algorithm is not creating the problem from scratch. It's reflecting and reproducing existing forms of inequity encoded in the geography of the city, of the nation, so that any conversation about technology can't start with the technology and its impacts. It has to start with the society and its inputs. And so when we zoom out and start the story, not in the middle, but at the beginning, then we come to very different conclusions. And one of the things we find when we reframe the analysis and the conversation is that there are two powerful narratives that are constantly told and that we end up telling about the relationship between technology and society. The first story is a techno-dystopian narrative, the idea that the robots are going to slay us. They're going to take all our jobs. They're going to rob us of our agency. Everything bad is associated with technology. And of course, this is the narrative that Hollywood loves to sell us, right? The Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. On your right is what we would call the techno-utopian narrative, the idea that these systems are going to save us. If only we would hand over our decisions to these automated systems, we'd be in better hands. And of course, this is the narrative that Silicon Valley works 24/7 to sell us. Now, they seem like opposing narratives, right? They have different endings, one in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. But they actually share an underlying logic, what we would call a techno-deterministic logic, which is just a fancy way of saying that we assume technology is in the driver's seat, propelled by a will of its own. It impacts us, but the humans behind the screen are missing from both of those scripts. The values, assumptions, ideologies, worldviews that get encoded into our digital worlds. And so one of the first things we have to do to broaden our social vision is to pull back the screen and to identify the agents and agencies that are shaping, or we might say imposing, their vision onto the rest of us. And so I think it's easier to pull back the screen and think critically about how technology relates to society in hindsight when we look to the past. One example of many we could point to of deadly data is the role of the company IBM in facilitating the Nazi Holocaust. You know, we associate this period in history with a few big bad boogeymen, but really it took what one author calls a bureaucracy of evil. People just doing their jobs, clocking in and out, putting their heads down, not being troublemakers, not asking any hard questions, that enabled this deadly machine to persist in the collection of data as a precursor to genocide. The question for us today is, what are the bureaucracies of evil operating right under our noses? Or even better, what are the bureaucracies of evil that we are clocking in and out of, where we are asked to put our heads down, to not ask any questions, not to be troublemakers? So again, in hindsight, it's easier to pull back the screen and understand the politics of technology and data, the complicity of everyday people and institutions. The challenge is when we turn to the present. Because while we definitely still have deadly data going on today, more often than not, these systems come wrapped in the veneer of beneficence. Not deadly data, but do-gooding data, presented to us as a fix, here to help, to make things more fair. One example of many, the Community Innovation Project brought to us from St. Paul, Minnesota. The school system joined forces with the police department to create this data sharing platform. The point of it was to determine which young people in the city were at risk of becoming future criminals, so that they would receive a predictive score, not too different from those A-level predictions. So in this case, community members, when they got wind of this, although it was wrapped in these really nice-sounding words, right? Community, yay, innovation, woohoo, who could argue with that? But their critical antenna went off because they thought, wait a minute, where are you getting all this data from? So you're getting it from students' suspension records, their attendance records, whether they have family members involved with the Child Protective Services or what we would call the family policing system, whether they already have family members in jail or prison, all of these sources of data to create this prediction. So members of the community said, wait a minute, none of these institutions have ever worked in the best interests of our young people. Why now, under the guise, the umbrella of this community innovation project, should we trust that it's going to turn out differently? So they met in the course of about a year after school in community centers and libraries. Not only did they put an end to this community innovation project, but they said, give us the resources that you're about to pour into this data sharing platform. Let us decide what would actually empower and not further stigmatize the youth in our city. And so they're demonstrating for us a twofold capacity that I encourage all of us to work harder to develop. And that is not only to be critical, which is very important and what we're really good at in academia, but to also be creative, to say not only what we don't want, but what do we want? Uprooting and seeding as two parts of the same world-building process, so that shifting from artificial intelligence to abundant imagination means that creativity should go hand in hand with critique, so that we ask ourselves, if not this version of society, with all of its tech-mediated injustices, then what? One of my favorite examples of critically and creatively reckoning with the politics of innovation is the white-collar crime early warning system, developed by artist Sam Levine. So this is a parody project that begins by subverting the racist logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast so-called street crime, this project flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. And you can actually download the app before you leave today so that when you go visit a new city, you know what areas to avoid. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but it includes an app that alerts users when they've entered high-risk areas to encourage awareness and vigilance. Taking it one step further, it proposes a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design the algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the averaged face of a criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical if we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices in the real world, in our cities and our borders. But again, artists are not the only ones with creative vision. As abolitionist poet Walida Imarisha writes, anytime We try to envision a different world without poverty, prisons, capitalism, war. We're engaging in science fiction. This includes those building worker movements within the tech industry, insisting that tech won't build it. No tech for ICE, no tech for tyrants, among other campaigns calling for companies to cease providing technology and software that enable oppressive policies and practices, from mass deportations in LA to ethnic cleansing in Gaza. In the European context, I've been learning more about the work of Abolish Frontex. The aim of this campaign is not to reform or improve Frontex or to replace it with more of the same. Instead, organizers are working to dismantle the border industrial complex while working towards a society where people are free to move and live. The word abolition, after all, contains the possibility for both uprooting and seeding, inviting us, abolere, to grow the kind of world where everyone can thrive. Abolish Frontex is part of a growing global movement, from the Internet Freedom Foundation in India to Hamle, working on Palestinian digital rights, Big Brother Watch here in the UK, and Take Back Tech, among many others. At the Take Back Tech's conference in Chicago last summer, I witnessed how organizers from around the world creatively confronted the coercive power of tech oligarchs, from those like the Athena Coalition, fighting data center construction, to those like the May 1st Movement technology, which is building autonomous technology infrastructure so that we don't have to rely on the likes of Google and Meta. Technology in this way is not closing off possibilities, predicting behavior, surveilling movement, colonizing the future. Instead, these initiatives put technology in service to liberatory visions of collective healing and world building. Instead of trying to make harmful systems a little less harmful, what if we worked to completely reimagine them, envisioning a world beyond borders, beyond policing, surveillance, supremacy? And in the process, I think we have to work on dismantling the walls in our own minds. That little voice that says, get real, every time we try to imagine otherwise. As one architect, Ronald Rayal, imagines binational libraries, shown here, where people share information and knowledge and where the border becomes nothing more than a bookshelf. Or his design of a teeter-totter that cuts across the US-Mexico border, where the actions on one side have a direct consequence on what happens on the other. After all, Rayal implores, the wall is cutting through people's lives. From architecture to augmented reality, one final example I'll share is the Phoenix of Gaza immersive experience, created by and for Palestinians and those who believe in the seemingly radical notion that all life is sacred. It invites us to walk around a virtual Gaza captured with a 360-degree camera before and after the most recent devastation, looking directly into the smiling faces of children playing in a park, standing next to a teenager passionately reciting poetry, peeking over the shoulder of elderly women in a sewing circle, and walking through the rubble of once magnificent churches, mosques, bathhouses. In this way, the Phoenix of Gaza team is preserving images of physical structures, cultural events, arts, dance, religious sites, and in the process, they're also imagining a world beyond settler colonialism, beyond apartheid and genocide, ultimately to return and rebuild. Taken together, all of these initiatives invite us to stop agonizing about a coming dystopia or longing for a future utopia, but instead to reckon with ustopia. Whereas utopias are the stuff of dreams, dystopias the stuff of nightmares, ustopias are what we create together when we're wide awake. In that spirit, I'm going to leave you with one final provocation inspired by the incomparable Octavia E. Butler, writer and builder of speculative worlds. And that is, it may be the end of the world, but there are other worlds. Thank you.
Thank Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be able to hear you speak to all of us and give us a sense of not just optimism, but sort of a path forward for expanding our minds. And as we're gathering questions for the Q&A, both online and here in the Great Hall, I wanted to just probe you a little, because we do have a lot of resonances in our work and have traveled similar paths. And one of the things that a lot of organizers and builders and movement folks have been talking about is money.
Yes.
And I can think of it also in relation to history as well, right? Because I'm very nerdy reading a book about the history of mathematical notation. It's partly to just kind of bone up on math and computational power. And one of the things in this book by Raul Rojas that really stuck with me was this point about how money has been an engine of innovation in mathematics and thus in computation. And now it feels like money, mathematics, and computation are really bound together, right? So these things, whether it's Bitcoin or otherwise, right, we're seeing a lot of money concentrated in a certain arena that makes it difficult to actualize visions. While at the same time, we're seeing things like Doge. We're seeing a discourse here about how we need a pro-growth AI future. We're also hearing about how we need to minimize civil service and so on and so forth, right? So and not to mention the collapse of the US aid and US support of global development, right? So we're seeing a lot of questions about money. And so I'm wondering how you respond to that. Like, where does money fit into this process of visioning?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's like one of those 3 dissertation worth questions, isn't it? Because depending on how we tackle it. And, you know, I think one of the interesting things when it comes to thinking about money, in my intro to sociology classes, it's often the thing that I'll use as an example of the power of imagination, the power of the social kind of cohesion that we all agree that this thing means something, right? And so as a material as it is, it's also ideological. We have to agree that this piece of paper means this and has this significance. So it's actually a really great starting point to think about imagination is on the ground materially. So that, oh, someone's phone is jingling, there we go. And so in the last chapter of the book Imagination, it's called the Imagination Incubator, and there's a set of exercises, prompts, activities to get us to stretch our imagination, especially as groups. You could do it as an individual, but there's a section in there around participatory budgeting, thinking about how this process that we see in many parts of the world of coming together to deliberate, to consult about how we want to invest money together, rather than just allowing it to be this kind of top-down or simply representative process, is actually a really powerful place to see how imagination shapes very mundane things. We're talking about it in the context of high-tech AI emerging, but something like an Excel sheet. If I put a photo of an Excel sheet with the amount of money that goes to different things in our city or our community, there's imagination in there that's shaping how we think about what is valuable, what do we want to grow, what do we not care about. In the US context, going back to education, if I showed you an Excel sheet that showed how different schools were allocated money, right? The investment in different types of children based on class and race. In my view, that's a eugenics imagination at work that shapes so much of our monetary policy, that says who is worth thriving and growing and building their capacity and who's disposable, who just needs to be a robot and a cog in a machine, right? And so it's a really powerful place for us to stretch our imagination and understand that this thing that often takes us in the realm of the airy-fairy really is grounded in our material world, which then comes to this question, two things I'll just last say about this, is that when we did that little exercise, oftentimes the response of those social visions will be, oh, where are we going to get the resources for that? How will we do this thing? But by juxtaposing it to these other dimensions of things that are happening, as science fiction level types of investment, that's seen as very feasible. So it's in juxtaposing these things where we can actually see the duplicity, the hypocrisy in those who want to convince us through all kinds of propaganda that these things are so unfeasible. Housing for all, healthcare for all, free public transportation, and yet we're building bunkers, going to the moon, building startup nations in the middle of the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's another site where we can see what I think of as a battle between different kinds of imagination is over resources and who gets to say what is feasible and not. We can't accept the terms of the debate as it's received. We have to push back on the fundamental assumptions that constantly tell us that these public goods are something that we don't have the funds for. And I guess the last thing I'll say specifically when it comes to technology is that for those of you who rightly draw the conclusion that so many of the biases and forms of discrimination and harm that we witness, kind of like on the downstream, can be tied back to the economic system that's the basis of their development, right? So you can, for example, have all of the diversity you want in terms of the tech workforce. But if the ecosystem in which those people are working and developing technologies continues to be about the maximization of profit, it doesn't matter how diverse the workforce is, they're still going to have to answer to that bottom line. So we have to think again and reimagine what that is. And there are people already doing it. And this is my point. What I try to do in all of my work is to tie these larger concepts to the examples that already exist so we can see the seed of something that we might want to grow. So one example that I would direct you all to is an initiative called Platform Cooperativism that uses a cooperativist model in order to develop technologies. And there are hundreds of projects, apps, initiatives that have already been developed under this. And I think the website is platformcoop.org, I think. But again, to think about what we need to change in order to see different ends on the downstream. And I think this is an important dimension of that.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I'll just get a show of hands. If you could just remember to raise your hands and state your name and affiliation when you're asking your question, to ask a question, hopefully a concise one. And stewards will come to you, and we have a question here. We'll start in the front row.
Hi, Seeta. I'm Christina Monteith. I'm a PhD student in the Media and Communications Department. I'm going to cheat a bit with my question and ask something that's directly relevant to my research.
So this is public office hours, is it?
Yes. So I'm looking at political imaginaries in the Caribbean, particularly in regards to feminist activism. Mm-hmm. And I think the question about money was so profound because one of the challenges that I'm reckoning with is, the need for money in organizing in the region, but the foreclosures that are enforced with, granting, for example. So I wanted to ask a question about how do we navigate that sort of tension, where the ideas that we have and the dreams that we have, even though, you might need USAID, you might need these big organizations' support. And without it, for some people, the work will never happen, especially in these contexts with low financial security. Yeah. How do you navigate that kind of tension and not let the imagination die?
Yeah, thank you for that. Seeta, do you have thoughts around that based on your organizing?
It's a very hard question. I mean, I think the way that I think about it is in relation to, there's a really fantastic article written by Maurice Mitchell. I think it's a year and 2 years now. I can't can't exactly remember, but it's called Building Resilient Organizations. And one of the most brilliant points in that piece was about division of labor. And to a certain extent, it feels like our shared imagination depends and thrives on a division of labor. So some of us need to deal with the resource question right now.
Yeah.
Because there are some very immediate things happening, right? You see this with anybody that's doing work in the tech and justice space right now, right? There's some really immediate concerns that need to be dealt with because people are being harmed.
Yeah.
At the same time, we still need those, I think, we need those thinkers. We need those people with that visionary mindset to help us draw that connection, to help us identify what are the interim steps that we can think about over the long term. So that's one thing that I think has been really helpful. And that's not to say it isn't, right? It is really difficult. But I think the division of labor point helps it seem more feasible.
Yeah, I think of that idea as the sort of bringing together of a pragmatic and a visionary approach. Like we need both. One shouldn't trump the other. Now, your question also makes me think like there's so many different types of convenings and fora and initiatives that use these set of buzzwords that would seem like there's some kind of shared goal in mind, whether we're talking about algorithmic justice, to all these tech bias, all of these, but so many of them are still not engaging those on the ground that are actually directly affected, most affected by the system. So I think those of us in this space also have a role to play in saying we don't need another conference on this, another brunch. I got invited to a brunch on Martha's Vineyard by a very wealthy foundation to have this conversation about, and I was thinking a brunch on Martha's Vineyard to talk about, okay, that there may be a place for that, but I feel like more importantly, I see it as our role to direct and to funnel funds to those organizations, grassroots initiatives, et cetera, the kinds that you're describing. And so, again, there's no outside to this, no clean place that you can work or think. We're all complicit, we all have a role to play, but I think we need to always be mindful, even among those who seem to share a set of goals and visions, the hierarchies at play, the power structures at play, and we need to do our part to subvert them and to have distributive justice as a part of our movement building as well.
Thank you. Yeah, here in the front. Yellow? Yellow. She's coming.
Hello, my name is Nof, and I study my master's in political sociology. And you said an interesting word just right now, division of labor. And I want to talk about it and ask a certain question when it comes to division of labor. And it will take me back to Karl Marx, since I'm a political sociology student as well. When we're talking about that, I'm thinking of the techno world that we're living in, specifically the ICT workers, the Uber drivers, and those workers with 0-hour contracts. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the system that those techno-lords or techno-oligarchs created. These laborers, they're just a dot in the system. Yeah. They're not together, like how it used to be in industrial time. Yeah. So it brings back to Karl Marx, the alienation of labor. Yeah. So my question would be two parts. Is this done strategically by design, or is it just a coincidence? Yeah. And the second part of the question is that how is this going to affect the union labor and everything in the future?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one of the reasons why I would say it's by design is because when workers in the gig workforce have tried to unionize and have tried to come together, we see the union busting. We see the great effort to keep people atomized, but to use the discourse of, free, you're, all of the ways that it's kind of maintained. And so there have been efforts, though, that have been successful to bring people together. There's a legal scholar whose name I can give you afterwards in California who has worked directly, for example, with Uber and Lyft drivers to help create, in fact, new platforms that they can communicate and organize and do things. And so, again, that's a way of using technology not to keep people sort of atomized and hierarchical, but to connect so that they can mobilize. And so we do see some efforts underway. But I think, in terms of the division of labor, where I also thought, was relevant is in the academy, when we think about what different fields are the division of labor, intellectual labor, also has a direct impact on the kinds of harms we see. Because there's a hierarchy. We know we have the language of these are the hard sciences, right? These are the soft sciences, humanities, arts are in the basement, But that knowledge hierarchy maps onto the world of work, where you have entire industries where you might have a token humanist, philosopher, historian in the mix, but their office is probably in the basement, and they're brought in after something bad has gone sideways and not as instrumental. And so one of the takeaways that in a longer talk that I would really try to impart is when it comes to the buzzwords around AI, one of them you'll hear a lot is that they're engaged in deep learning, by which people mean computational depth. And what I want to suggest is that computational depth without social and historical depth ain't that deep. It's superficial learning. So what we have are people building technologies for society that have a very elementary understanding of society, of history, of social relations, all of these things, and yet they're lauded as geniuses and innovators. And so rather than saying, the public needs to have more scientific literacy, I often push back and say, no, scientists and technologists need more social literacy. And so this has to do with a division of intellectual labor that directly shapes our own working environment that I think we have the power to disrupt and reimagine as well.
Before I get more questions from our in-person audience, do we have any questions from online? Yeah. Do you want somebody bring the mic to the mom and she can read a question, please? Thank you. Right here in the front.
Thank you. We've got a few online questions. One on how do we begin to have meaningful conversations with policymakers to ensure that previously disadvantaged communities are not left behind by emerging technologies? And a similar question also on how do those of us who work on trying to make AI systems less bad overcome the sense of doom and frustration in this AI tsunami?
Thank you for that. I'll just pick up on the first one to say, as a starting point, now again, it's a loaded, big question that many people are working on, thinking about how to engage policymakers. And I always think, okay, well, what are the assumptions embedded in this question that communities are being left behind? Again, that presumes a certain kind of binary between where the innovation is and where the lack is. It's a deficit framing of what is in communities. They're lacking something, they're not doing something. So I'd like to reframe it and say, actually, you need the knowledge and the know-how and the experiential insight that comes from navigating a society that was built to sabotage you at every turn. So that community is not simply a charitable case that we need to create policy to help, but it's a source of knowledge that we need upstream before we start developing things. That is where we need to go. And there's many examples that I can point to if we had more time in Q&A, where ignoring that community knowledge and insight has gone sideways. You develop a product, and precisely because you ignored something, now you have a big PR fiasco. That if only you had thought that that was valuable knowledge. And so again, this is a reframing to say, it's not you as a policymaker simply trying to help a community catch up and be more innovative. It's actually to redefine what innovation is. That if it's just about economic growth, if it's just about material well-being without thinking about all of these other values and factors, it's not that innovative. So we have to reclaim the language and reframe the debate on our terms that's not through a deficit lens, but to say what we would call an asset approach. What actually exists that's valuable? So another shorthand is to say moving from a charitable model of policy and organizing, et cetera, to a solidaristic model where we understand that we're in this together and that there's knowledge not just coming out of the academy, but coming out of histories and experiences in our home communities. And I'll leave the second one.
Great. I think we had a question in the front here. We'll start here, and then it seems like I'm going to have to collect questions right in the back, yeah, and then we'll collect questions in the next round.
Thank you. Hi, Matt Mahmoudi with Amnesty and Cambridge Digital Humanities. We've just watched the border literally be set on fire in Los Angeles in the form of the Waymo cars. Unmanned, they were hailed.
Yeah.
We know that they're surveilling people, undocumented communities, and we know they're relaying information back to ICE.
Yeah.
Now that destruction is quite instructive as far as imagination goes, right? And I was really curious about your thinking about the role of destruction.
Yes.
And some of the bigger thinking we're doing around imagination.
Yes. Yeah, I love that question because it is a reminder that it's not simply about broadening imagination, but we also need to work on making some things unimaginable that are currently ubiquitous, that we take for granted, that we're taught not to question. So we need to think in that way. In some ways, that fire is telling us, like, this should not be a thing. Like, someone's imagination was materialized in this surveillance, mobile surveillance unit, and this should be unimaginable. So I think of destruction and construction as two parts of a process. Again, the other metaphor is uprooting and seeding, but too often destruction is pathologized, and those who destroy are pathologized. But that's also a precursor. It creates a fertile ground for them thinking about what we want to grow. But the challenge is getting to that point. If we're always in the, destruction mode, deconstructive mode in intellectual terms, and we don't turn to the process of, okay, what do we want to build and grow? I think we have to carve out more intellectual space, organizing space, yes, but even intellectual space to ask those questions about the affirmative side of things. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to be bold and try and collect 3 questions because I think that's really all we have time for. So if you could be concise and also remember to state your name and affiliation.
Sure, thank you. My name is Ramla, studying Design Futures Masters at the Royal College of Art. Kind of touching on some of the things that you mentioned around abolition, AI, and algorithmic justice. We see that a lot of governments are kind of rushing to draft action plans and kind of reshaping the economy around AI, but it does seem that we're not really looking at, in as much detail, the negative effects of these AI. It seems to be like even governments have co-opted into this hype.
Yes.
And looking at some of the works around eliminating biases and kind of racial injustice seems to be around using existing models that we already know are built on kind of colonialism and injustice to try and fix them and make them better. So what are your thoughts on kind of abolishing current AI models and imagining a future where models are created and owned by communities from scratch? Is that a vision we should have around using AI but recreating it from the very beginning? Or are we still co-opting to this AI hype by trying to recreate it?
Yeah, such a good question.
Great. Go in the back there, holding the pen. Yes. And again, if you could keep it concise.
Thank you. I'll try my best to be concise. I'm autistic and my brain doesn't work like that. So I'm really grateful, firstly, to be in this space and sharing space with Ruha, whose work I've been a massive fan of since I started my PhD. I'm a precarious academic worker and an organizer for students of color groups within Bristol Law School. Okay. So I really want to ground us into the university as a space, especially given the space we're in right now, where this was the zone of the LSE liberated zone, very much over here. And so what does it mean for us to have visions of the future, which are liberatory and abolitionist, especially in a space like the LSE or my own employer, where this is not only suppressed quite actively through using police violence, but also disciplinary proceedings, etc., but also you are incentivized to do the kind of community-engaged research, which means giving diversity training to cops. And so there's this active suppression of actual visions of a liberated future and liberating universities and liberating knowledge, which is actively being suppressed. And I'm just wondering what your reflections on that are, because I know you're also very invested in this conversation.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take those 2 questions, just given the time, if that's okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. So AI hype and the idea of, moving beyond the sort of large language, the large models, et cetera, I would turn to my sister colleague, Timnit Gebru, who, when she left Google, started the Distributed AI Research Group, which I think is informed by this question, this idea of starting much early in the process to think about not only where we get data, but what we consider to be meaningful data. Sort of flipping the script so that we use technology and digital tools to shine a light on power in order to transform it. I'll give you one just concrete example of, in the spirit of the white-collar early crime, which is a parity project. There is something used in the US called the Student Success Predictor Score that is essentially meant to help students graduate. So it intervenes early, decides who's low, medium, high risk of perhaps not graduating, so we can steer them, clear. So that might involve you meeting with an advisor that pushes you to a different major that will increase your likelihood, et cetera. So in this case, going to your question, we could say, well, in the first audit of this algorithm, researchers found that Black students were labeled high risk at quadruple the rate of their white peers. Black students in STEM fields were among the highest. So we could say, let's tweak it. Let's figure out how to make this less biased, maybe have equal opportunity discrimination, right? Everyone needs to, feel the stigma equally, let's say, or et cetera. So there's ways in the first choice you gave, like how do we tweak it? Or we could say, why are we directing the digital lens at students who are trying to navigate often what is a hostile environment? Why don't we, rather than measuring risk or riskiness of individual students, why don't we figure out who's producing the risk in the first place? So we turn the digital lens in the direction of those who are actually shaping the environments. It might be professors, administrators, whatever you have, but those in power who often want to evade scrutiny, like the white-collar criminals. Don't look at us, even though this algorithm is meant to help. We don't want to be helped. Right? And so again, it's saying not just tweaking, but changing the starting question to say, if we're going to use it, why are we always pointing these tools at the most vulnerable in any environment, right? Why don't we actually look in the direction and flip the script, if we're going to use them at all, and that needs to be a question on the table, to shine a light on those in power. And that's a more, I think, subversive way of approaching things. It's not just about reforming and tweaking and debiasing, but it's changing the starting questions that we have. Are we?
Quickly.
Okay. Yes. There's so much to say about how these institutions suppress our imagination. But one of the ways that I engage and don't get disillusioned and don't fall into despair is when we are attacked and suppressed and targeted, as many of us are, pushed out, put on probation, as I am right now. When that happens, to me, that I accept that as a signal that what I'm doing must be working. It must be a problem. It must be challenging something. It must be meaningful. What we teach must have power if they're trying to ban our classes, change the words that we use. So in many ways, I, in my own imagination, flip what is, on one level, an attack, and I see it as an affirmation. And it actually gives me fuel to keep going, right? And it might not be able to do it in the same context, so part of it is to have a kind of dexterity in how we navigate. But I feel like we have the power not to accept what's being imposed on us, but to use our own imagination to say, we must be doing something right if you're doing all this effort, passing laws, changing policies, all because we're teaching something. And so again, I think that is one way to reframe. And there's more to it, of course, that maybe we'll chat at the book signing table. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much to Ruha.
Pleasure.
There are lots more exciting events coming up over the next few days at the festival, so do take a copy of the program on your way out if you haven't. And also copies of Ruha's recent books will be, or book as well as books, are behind this column here. They're available for sale, and Ruha will be staying around for a signing. So thank you so much. It's
Can
so
we give
wonderful
Seeta a hand, please?
to have you here.